Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of The Loft. Tonight I have a very special guest. Besides being an RN and being my mom, I have Catherine Cipollina.
Hey.
Welcome to the show. Yeah, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to be here.
So, I've been wanting to interview you for a long time. So I finally got you tonight, so I have some questions for you.
All right.
So my first question is, you were born in 1949. Tell us a little bit about growing up in the 50s.
Well, growing up in the 50s was much different than it is today. Growing up in the 50s was a lot calmer than it is today. I grew up on a lake called Cannon Lake, and we all went outside to play every day. That's what life was like then. We went swimming, we went ice skating, we had all woods around our home, and we went blueberry picking, apple picking, strawberry picking. So it was a nice environment back in those days.
So who did you admire in the 50s as a child?
I have to say I admired my sister, and I have an older sister. Her name is Vicky, and I kind of idolized her because she was older than me, and she was allowed to do things that I wasn't allowed to do. She was allowed to go to the store across the lake that I wasn't allowed to. And I always felt like she knew a lot more than I did, which she most likely did.
Okay, so another question is, who was the president in the 50s, the first half and the second half? Who was the president at those times?
The first half was Eisenhower, and the second half was John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was very charismatic. He was one of the youngest presidents. He also was a very handsome man. So he was one of the most popular presidents of that time, and still of today, one of the most popular presidents.
So what are some of your favorite memories from that time, from the 50s?
From the 50s, my favorite memory was my sister and I, and a whole group of us children put on a play. I think the name of the play was Bye Bye Birdie. My sister had been in school, and she was in a play, Bye Bye Birdie. So that's where we think the name came from. But it was dancing and singing, and we had an audience, and we charged 10 cents to get into the play. And from that, each of us made like 35 cents, and we all went to the movies, and we went out for Chinese food. It was one of the most wonderful things of childhood.
Wow. So who was a big star in the 50s that you saw, that you
Well, my family didn't have television at that time, and most of my friends didn't have a TV. One of the stars that I remember being talked about was Elvis Presley, Anne Margaret, Marilyn Monroe were some of the big names back then.
Okay. So you grew up as a teenager in the 60s. Tell us a little bit about that.
That was a very tumultuous time in the 60s. The Vietnam War was happening at that time, and I was in high school at that time. Martin Luther King was an activist at that time, and there was a lot of talk at that time about the civil rights movement. Also in 1969, the first man walked on the moon because President Kennedy initiated the space program.
Okay, so we know from history, 1964 to 1968 were very explosive times in America. Could you tell us about those times?
Well, that was the Vietnam War at that time. The Vietnam War lasted until it ended in probably 1974 maybe it ended. But in 1964, the draft came about. It was 2.2 million men were drafted into the war. Out of those 2.2 million men that were drafted, 58,000 of them gave their lives for America.
So, on a different note, who did you admire, who did you look up to in the 60s?
Well, I had a cousin, her name was Barbara Jean, and she became a nurse. And everyone in the family very much appreciated her, and she was everybody admired her. So
Right.
that gave me the idea at that time that it was somebody that I really could look up to.
Wow. So, another question I have, what were some of your favorite books that you read growing up?
Uh, the Chronicles of Narnia is 7 books, and I started reading them when I was 7 years old. I read them again when I was 9 years old, and at 70 years old I could read them again. It was all about fantasy, good versus evil. Great books for anyone that likes to read now.
Great, great. So, you have lived through a lot, Ma. You have lived through a lot of eras. You have lived through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. What was your favorite era?
My favorite era was 1980s. I got married in 1969. My firstborn was my son Richie in 1970. My secondborn was you, Jamie, in 1975. And my third son, Damien, was born in 1977. In the 80s, I went to school for nursing. I had a dream, and I followed that dream, and I became an RN. During those years, my sons were growing up. My son Jamie, you were around 8 or 9 when I graduated in 1983. And then I worked for Nassau County Medical Center for 33 years. And then I went to visiting nurse service for about a year or so.
Could you also tell us a little bit about your holistic background?
Yeah, and in 1981, I met my partner for life, and I also went to school in 1986, I believe, for holistic nursing. I went to New York Center College, and that gave a whole different perspective on nursing.
Okay.
It was all about herbology, different modems of how to heal.
Okay.
If anyone knows anything about Reiki, it was about the energies of the human body, what they did, how they helped heal, different colors, different crystals. And I still use that today. And when I worked in the burn center, I used those modalities to help people through all different types of pain, with healing. I still use it today. When anyone has a problem, they usually come to me, and I try to get them through it with herbs or different modalities of healing.
So, could you tell us what are some of your favorite hobbies to do?
Oh geez, since I've been in my 20s, I always liked baking. I love gardening. Just recently, about 4 years ago, I started watercolor painting, and I really enjoy those things.
Okay, Ma. I mean, you have lived such a wild life. You've seen a lot. What would be some of your advice for young people today? What advice would you give a young person today?
For today, that's one thing I could say is wisdom comes from the elimination of non-essential things. That means, to me, people are the most important things. If you're going to do something in life, surround yourself with people that are kind and good. And that's pretty much how I feel about life at this age.
Okay, Ma. Well, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Jane, for having me. It was a pleasure.
I'm glad you were on this week's of the Loft. Remember, guys, to hit like and click subscribe. And also, you can follow me on Instagram. And we're going to have a very special guest next week. So make sure you tune in. Thank you, guys. See you next time. Bye.